Imagine walking into a room where everyone already thinks they know your story. They've read the accusations, heard the rumors, studied the evidence, and quietly decided who you are before you've even opened your mouth. And then something changes. Not because you screamed louder, not because you threatened anyone, but because the facts finally start speaking for themselves. Funny how quickly confidence disappears when assumptions meet reality. People love judging from a distance, because distance makes everything simple. Good person, bad person, guilty, innocent, winner, loser. But real life isn't that clean, and sometimes the story you've been carrying isn't the story the evidence tells. Maybe you've spent years being misunderstood, blamed, dismissed, or reduced to one mistake, while nobody bothered to examine the whole picture. But don't turn that into a fantasy about everyone secretly being against you. Stay grounded. Look at what you can actually prove. Document what matters. Speak clearly. Learn the rules. Take responsibility for what belongs to you, and challenge what doesn't. Because when the truth is finally examined carefully, you don't need theatrics to make it powerful. You need facts, patience, and the discipline to let reality stand on its own. And sometimes the greatest victory isn't watching someone fall apart when they discover they were wrong. It's realizing you no longer need their approval to know who you are, while the room changes its opinion one piece of evidence at a time. And the people who thought they had your entire story suddenly realize they were reading only one page, leaving you with something far more valuable than revenge. The clarity to move forward without carrying every accusation that was ever thrown at you, while you remain calm enough to let the truth do what arguments never could. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can keep the dark, cynical, psychologically intense energy you want. People are remarkably good at creating a verdict before they've bothered to examine the evidence, because a confident accusation is easier to understand than a complicated truth. And once a story spreads far enough, people start treating repetition as proof, as if saying something 100 times somehow transforms it into a fact. But reality doesn't work that way. And if you've ever found yourself surrounded by people who already decided who you were before hearing your side, you know how frustrating it can be to watch assumptions become conclusions, especially when defending yourself emotionally only seems to make the situation worse, because anger gives people something else to discuss, your reaction instead of the facts, your frustration instead of the evidence, your tone instead of what actually happened. And that's why composure can become one of your greatest advantages. Not because you should remain silent when something important needs to be addressed, but because you want your response to be stronger than the accusation, and strength doesn't always sound loud. Sometimes it looks like patience, documentation, clear communication, and refusing to exaggerate what you cannot prove. Because when people accuse you, your first instinct may be to explain everything immediately. But sometimes the smartest move is to slow down and separate what you know from what you assume. Gather the relevant information, keep records when necessary, and communicate only what can be supported. Because facts have a strange quality that emotional arguments don't possess. They can stand there quietly without needing you to protect them every second, while accusations often depend on urgency, confusion, and emotional pressure. And if you allow yourself to be rushed into defending every little detail, you may accidentally create contradictions or give attention to claims that never deserved it. So learn to ask simple questions. What exactly is being claimed? What evidence supports it? What evidence contradicts it? What part is actually my responsibility? And what information is missing? Because those questions move you away from panic and toward clarity. And clarity is especially valuable when other people want you to react emotionally, while you remain calm enough to examine the situation. You may discover that some accusations contain a small piece of truth, surrounded by exaggeration, and if they do, own the truthful part without accepting everything attached to it. Because taking responsibility for your actual mistakes makes you stronger, not weaker, and it prevents other people from controlling you through guilt. While false accusations can also become easier to challenge, when you don't weaken your own credibility by turning every disagreement into a dramatic battle. Because credibility is built through consistency, and consistency means your words match the facts, your behavior matches your claims, and your story remains stable even when emotions rise, while the people around you may be waiting for you to explode. You can give them something much less entertaining and far more difficult to dismiss. A calm response supported by reality, because you don't need to perform innocence. You need to communicate truthfully. And there is a major difference. Performance depends on convincing people, while honesty depends on accurately representing what happened, including the parts that don't make you look perfect, because nobody is helped by pretending you've never made mistakes. And admitting a mistake doesn't automatically validate every accusation against you. It simply demonstrates that you can distinguish responsibility from exaggeration. While time passes and more information becomes available, people may revise their opinions. Some may apologize. Some may remain stubborn, and some may never admit they were wrong. But your goal shouldn't be to force every person to change their mind, because that gives them control over your peace. Your goal should be to make sure your own conduct remains grounded in truth, evidence, and self-respect. And if the situation involves something serious, seek appropriate professional or legal advice, rather than trying to handle everything through emotion or social pressure, because real consequences require real care. While you continue letting facts speak louder than accusations, you begin to understand that you don't have to chase every rumor, answer every whisper, or defend yourself against every imaginary courtroom, because some claims collapse when nobody feeds them attention, and some truths become stronger with time, leaving you free to focus on what you can actually control: your conduct, your decisions, your evidence, your boundaries, and your future. While everyone else decides what story they want to believe, you can remain committed to what can actually be demonstrated. Because when your words, actions, and evidence consistently point in the same direction, you don't need to shout over the noise. You simply need to remain steady enough for reality to be seen. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can keep the dark, cynical, psychologically intense energy you want. One mistake has a funny way of becoming an entire identity when you allow other people, or even your own mind, to keep replaying it, because suddenly you aren't the person who made a bad decision. You're the person who always ruins things. You aren't someone who failed at something. You're a failure, and one painful chapter becomes the entire book, which is convenient for people who want simple labels, because simple labels require no understanding, no context, and certainly no forgiveness. But your life is far more complicated than one moment, one argument, one failure, one rejection, or one decision you wish you could take back. And if you spend your entire existence trying to escape one old version of yourself, you'll accidentally give that version more power than it deserves. Because the past can explain you without having to permanently define you. And that's an important distinction. You can acknowledge what happened without allowing it to become your identity. Because maturity isn't pretending your mistakes never happened. It's becoming honest enough to study them, understand them, and change the behavior that created them. While people may continue bringing up something you did years ago because it gives them a convenient weapon, you don't have to pretend you were perfect. But you also don't have to keep accepting a permanent sentence for a temporary failure. If you made a mistake, ask what you learned, what damage can reasonably be repaired, what behavior needs to change, and what boundary or system can prevent the same pattern from repeating. Because regret without reflection becomes self-punishment, while regret combined with responsibility can become wisdom. And there is a huge difference between the two. Self-punishment keeps you staring backward, while responsibility asks what you are going to do differently now. And that's where your power returns. Because you cannot change the moment that already happened, but you can change what the moment produces in the person you become. While someone may say, "You always do this," you don't have to argue emotionally. You can examine whether the pattern is actually true, and if it is, change it. If it isn't, don't let a careless label become your identity. Because people sometimes remember your worst moment more clearly than your 100 ordinary moments of decency, especially when your mistake affected them personally. And you may have to accept that some people will never completely forget what happened. But their memory doesn't have to become your prison. While you rebuild trust, you may need patience. Because apologies don't automatically erase consequences, and forgiveness cannot be demanded, but you can still demonstrate change through consistent behavior over time. Because the strongest answer to a repeated accusation isn't always another explanation. Sometimes it's a different pattern of living. When you become more responsible, more disciplined, more thoughtful, and more careful with your decisions, you're not rewriting history. You're creating evidence that history isn't controlling your future. While you continue growing, you may discover that some of the harshest judgment wasn't coming from other people at all. It was coming from you. Because it's easy to believe you deserve to remain ashamed forever when you haven't learned how to forgive yourself. But self-forgiveness isn't pretending the mistake didn't matter. It means accepting that the person who made the mistake is capable of learning, changing, and becoming wiser. And if you refuse to allow yourself that possibility, you are demanding perfection from a human being who was never capable of it. While the world keeps reminding you of what you were, your responsibility is to keep demonstrating what you're becoming. Not with dramatic announcements, not with promises shouted in moments of emotion, but through repeated choices that make the old pattern less and less familiar. Because identity is built through behavior, and every decision becomes another vote for the person you're becoming. You can choose patience instead of impulsiveness, honesty instead of excuses, discipline instead of avoidance, responsibility instead of blame, and learning instead of defensiveness. While none of those choices can erase the past, they can change its meaning, turning a failure into a lesson, a painful relationship into a boundary, a poor decision into experience, and a period of weakness into evidence that you eventually learned how to become stronger. While some people may never update their opinion of you, you don't have to spend your entire life campaigning for their approval. Because your future isn't a popularity contest, and the person you become matters more than the label somebody attached to you during your worst moment. Allowing you to move forward without denying what happened, without glorifying it, and without letting it dictate every decision that comes next. Because one chapter can be ugly without making the entire book worthless. And one mistake can be serious without becoming the final definition of who you are. While you keep learning, repairing, changing, and choosing differently, the story continues, and the next pages are still being written by what you decide to do now. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can keep the dark, cynical, psychologically intense energy you want. There is a strange kind of strength in looking at your own mistakes without running away from them, because most people would rather build an elaborate courtroom in their head where everyone else is guilty, and they are merely the unfortunate victim of circumstances, bad timing, other people's decisions, terrible luck, and every possible excuse that makes the mirror easier to avoid. But eventually, the excuses become heavier than the mistake itself. Because when you blame everything outside yourself, you also give away the power to change what happens next. And that's why responsibility matters, not as punishment, but as control. Because if something genuinely belongs to you, you can work on it, you can repair it, you can learn from it, and you can prevent yourself from repeating it. While taking responsibility doesn't mean accepting every accusation thrown at you. It means becoming precise enough to identify your actual part and separate it from everything that isn't yours. Maybe you said something cruel during an argument. Own it. Maybe you ignored a warning because your ego was louder than your judgment. Own it. Maybe you broke someone's trust. Admit it, apologize sincerely, and change the behavior. But if someone blames you for their reaction, their choices, or circumstances you could never control, don't automatically accept that burden just because guilt feels easier than conflict. Because responsibility without boundaries turns into self-destruction. And self-destruction isn't accountability, it's another way of avoiding the real work. While you examine your actions honestly, ask yourself what happened. What did I do? What could I have done differently? What consequences were reasonably connected to my choices? And what belongs to another person? Because those questions keep you grounded, and grounded people are much harder to manipulate, since manipulation often depends on confusion about responsibility. Someone makes a mistake and convinces you that you caused it. Someone crosses your boundary and then blames you for becoming upset. Someone treats you badly and tells you that your reaction is the real problem. And suddenly, you're spending all your energy defending yourself instead of examining what actually happened. But emotional maturity means you can hold two truths at once. You can acknowledge that your reaction wasn't perfect while still recognizing that someone else's behavior was wrong. You can apologize for your tone without apologizing for having a boundary. You can admit your mistake without accepting a fictional version of events. And you can care about someone's feelings without becoming responsible for controlling those feelings. While this distinction becomes clearer, you stop fearing accountability because accountability no longer means humiliation. It becomes a tool for improvement. When you make a mistake, you don't need to hide it behind excuses, because hiding mistakes prevents learning. And when you can say, "I was wrong about that," without collapsing into shame, you become much more capable of changing. Because your ego no longer has to defend every decision you've ever made. And that's a dangerous advantage in a world where people often confuse confidence with never admitting weakness. Because genuine confidence can survive correction, it can survive criticism, it can survive the realization that you misunderstood something, while fragile confidence needs everyone to believe you're right all the time. Strong confidence needs only the willingness to become better, and that means you can examine yourself without destroying yourself. You can accept consequences without turning them into an identity. And you can make repairs without begging for approval. While other people may refuse to accept your apology, you can still do the responsible thing. Because your responsibility is to control your conduct, not the outcome of another person's forgiveness. And sometimes the most mature action is accepting that you cannot undo the past. Only behave differently from this point forward, while you continue taking ownership of what genuinely belongs to you. You become less interested in proving that you're perfect and more interested in becoming trustworthy, because perfection is an illusion, but reliability can be built through repeated choices. And every time you keep your word, correct your mistake, respect another person's boundary, admit uncertainty, or stop yourself from repeating an old pattern, you're building evidence that your character isn't determined by one bad moment. while responsibility also gives you freedom from endless blame, because once you know what is yours, you can stop carrying what isn't. You can return another person's anger to them, return another person's choices to them, return circumstances beyond your control to reality, and keep your own attention focused on the part of the situation where you actually have influence. And that is where growth becomes practical, not dramatic, not theatrical, not something you announce to the world, but something you demonstrate through better decisions when the same kind of pressure appears again. Because the real test of learning isn't whether you can explain your mistake perfectly. It's whether you behave differently when life gives you another opportunity to repeat it, while you keep choosing responsibility over excuses and clarity over blame. You begin building a kind of inner authority that doesn't need to pretend you're flawless, because you know you can face your own mistakes without being destroyed by them, correct what needs correcting, protect what needs protecting, and keep moving without handing your entire identity over to either guilt or other people's judgment. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can keep the dark, cynical, psychologically intense energy you want. There is a moment when a room changes, when people stop listening to what you're saying and start listening for the reaction they expect from you, waiting for anger, panic, defensiveness, maybe even one careless sentence they can use against you. And that's when most people lose the advantage they had, because they think they need to fight harder when what they really need is to become harder to provoke. Because when everyone expects you to explode, calmness becomes its own kind of strength, not the fake calm where you pretend nothing bothers you, but the deliberate calm that comes from knowing you don't have to answer everything immediately. You don't have to prove your innocence in one breath, and you don't have to let someone else's emotional state become yours. Because pressure has a way of shrinking your thinking, making everything feel urgent, making you believe that if you don't respond right now, you've lost. But urgency isn't always truth, and speed isn't always intelligence. Sometimes the smartest response is to slow the situation down enough to see what is actually happening, what was said, what was assumed, what can be proven, and what you need before making a decision, while people around you may be raising their voices, interrupting you, questioning your character, or demanding an immediate answer. You can breathe, listen, and choose your words carefully. Because emotional control isn't weakness, it's the ability to keep your judgment online while everyone else is losing theirs. And that skill becomes especially valuable when you're misunderstood, accused, or placed under pressure. Because the easiest way to weaken yourself is to start defending every detail emotionally, jumping from one accusation to another, trying to convince everyone at once, and accidentally creating more confusion, while a calm person can say, "Let's deal with one fact at a time," and suddenly the conversation has structure again. Because you aren't allowing the situation to dictate the rules of engagement, you're choosing them. And that's important, because not every conflict deserves the same response. Some situations require clarification, some require boundaries, some require documentation, some require professional help, and some require you to walk away entirely. But none of those decisions become easier when you're reacting from anger. While you learn to pause before responding, you create space between what happens and what you do about it. And inside that space is where your freedom lives, because someone can insult you, but they cannot automatically control your response. Someone can misunderstand you, but they cannot force you to abandon your principles. Someone can accuse you, but they cannot decide how you conduct yourself. And someone can try to provoke you, but they cannot win unless you hand them access to your emotions. While staying calm doesn't mean becoming passive, because there are moments when you must speak clearly, defend yourself, set a boundary, correct false information, or take appropriate action, but the difference is that you're acting from judgment rather than rage. And that distinction can change the entire outcome, because anger wants immediate satisfaction, while strategy is willing to wait for the right moment. Anger wants the last word, while wisdom wants the right outcome. Anger wants people to feel what you felt, while maturity asks what response actually protects your future. And when you start thinking that way, you stop measuring victory by how badly you embarrassed someone, and start measuring it by whether you handled yourself in a way you can respect later. While other people may continue trying to pull you into emotional chaos, you don't have to follow them there. You can listen without absorbing, respond without attacking, disagree without becoming destructive, and leave without turning your departure into another argument, because your peace is not something you should repeatedly sacrifice just to prove that you can win a confrontation. While the room may still misunderstand you, some people may still believe the wrong story, and some may refuse to hear anything that challenges their opinion. But you cannot control every mind in the room. You can control the quality of your conduct, the accuracy of your words, the evidence you provide, and the boundaries you maintain. And those are enough to keep you grounded when everything around you becomes noisy. While time often reveals what emotional arguments hide, consistent behavior becomes more convincing than one dramatic explanation, and a calm pattern of honesty becomes harder to dismiss than a desperate attempt to control everyone's opinion. So let people talk, let them speculate, let them make their assumptions if they choose. But don't allow their noise to make decisions for you, because the person who can remain composed when pressure is highest is often the person who can think most clearly, and the person who can think clearly has options. While everyone else is reacting, you can observe. While everyone else is rushing, you can evaluate. While everyone else is demanding a performance, you can simply tell the truth as accurately as you know it, and refuse to add drama to what doesn't require it. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do, when the entire room seems determined to misunderstand you, is to remain calm enough that you don't become a worse version of yourself just to convince them you're a better one. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can keep the dark, cynical, psychologically intense energy you want. Revenge is seductive because it whispers a very simple promise. Make them feel what they made you feel. Hurt them the way they hurt you. Embarrass them the way they embarrassed you. Expose them the way they exposed you. And suddenly the pain inside you feels like it has a destination. But there is a problem with that little promise. Revenge keeps you emotionally connected to the person you claim you want to escape, because every plan requires their attention. Every decision revolves around their reaction. Every victory depends on whether they notice, and every quiet moment becomes another opportunity to imagine how they might suffer, which means they are still occupying space in your mind long after you supposedly walked away. And that's not freedom. That's another kind of captivity, while clarity asks a much colder and more useful question. What do I actually want my life to look like now? Not what will make them jealous, not what will make them regret losing you, not what will make everyone finally admit that you were right, but what genuinely makes your future stronger, healthier, calmer, and more meaningful, because once you ask that question, the entire strategy changes. You stop building your life around someone else's downfall and start building it around your own direction. And that can be far more powerful than revenge, because it doesn't require their participation. While revenge needs an audience, clarity needs only a decision. You can set a boundary without humiliating someone, leave a situation without destroying it, protect yourself without becoming cruel, and expose genuine wrongdoing through appropriate channels without turning your life into an endless personal war, because there is a difference between seeking accountability and seeking emotional punishment. Accountability focuses on facts, consequences, repair, and protection, while revenge focuses on pain, humiliation, and satisfaction. And the second one can easily become another trap, especially when you're angry enough to believe that hurting someone will finally heal you, because anger can tell you that you deserve justice, while quietly encouraging you to make decisions you'll regret later. And that's why clarity requires patience. When you're furious, don't make permanent decisions simply to create temporary emotional relief. Step back, gather information, consider consequences, talk to someone trustworthy when appropriate, and decide what response protects your interests, rather than satisfying your anger for 10 minutes. Because your future deserves better than being designed during your worst emotional moment. While you move away from revenge, you don't have to pretend the harm didn't matter. Forgiveness is not required in order to move forward, and letting go doesn't mean approving of what happened. It means refusing to allow the event to keep controlling your choices. You can remember the lesson without carrying the resentment. You can acknowledge betrayal without becoming obsessed with proving the betrayer is evil. And you can protect yourself without spending years trying to destroy someone else's reputation. While clarity becomes your goal, you start seeing choices that revenge hides. You can improve your skills, strengthen your finances, repair healthy relationships, build your confidence, protect your boundaries, and create distance from environments that repeatedly damage your peace. And none of those actions require the person who hurt you to understand anything, apologize, or regret anything, which is precisely why they are so powerful, because your progress no longer depends on their behavior. While some people may expect you to fight forever, because conflict keeps you connected to them, you can surprise them by becoming unavailable for the drama, not because you're afraid, but because you have better things to do with your attention, and attention is one of the most valuable resources you possess. Once you spend it, you don't get that hour back, that day back, that month back. So ask yourself whether the argument, message, investigation, or revenge fantasy deserves another piece of your limited life. Because sometimes the greatest victory is realizing that the person who hurt you doesn't deserve another chapter in your future. While you choose clarity, you also become more honest about your own responsibility. Maybe you made mistakes. Maybe you ignored warning signs. Maybe you stayed too long. Maybe you trusted too quickly. And admitting those things doesn't make you weak. It gives you information. Because the goal is not to create a perfect story where you did everything right. The goal is to understand what happened well enough to make better decisions next time. And that requires a mind clear enough to learn, while revenge keeps asking, how can I make them pay? Clarity asks, how can I make sure I never lose myself like this again? And that second question changes everything, because now the pain becomes information instead of identity. The disappointment becomes instruction instead of destiny. And the experience becomes something you can use without allowing it to define every relationship that comes afterward. While you continue choosing clarity over revenge, you may notice that your strongest responses become quieter. You stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You stop chasing apologies that may never come. You stop checking whether someone regrets their behavior, and you stop measuring your healing by their suffering, because your life has finally become too important to organize around another person's mistakes, leaving you with something revenge could never give you, the freedom to make your next decision based on who you want to become, rather than what someone else did to you.